Hello YouTubers, welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha, and today I'm going to be looking at the movie version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy from 2005. So, a little background. Douglas Adams had, for many years, attempted to get a Hitchhiker's movie off the ground, beginning as early as 1982, when a development deal was set up with Ivan Reitman's production company. Adams completed 3 drafts of a screenplay under the guidance of Reitman. Work seemed to be going well. Casting talk floated such ideas as Simon Jones, who was having a stab at a Hollywood career himself at the time, maybe reprising his role as Arthur. The likes of Dan Aykroyd and Jeff Goldblum were named as possible Fords, and Bill Murray was even considered for Zaphod. The writing process was, by all accounts, extremely collaborative, with Reitman reluctant to just do a cut and paste job of the previous iterations, and the subsequent revisions of the screenplay would accommodate his vision for how the story could deviate from some of the jokes, scenes, and even the story itself established in the source material. However, it was not meant to be, as it was during this very developmental phase that possible Ford Dan Aykroyd pitched the concept for a certain modern gothic comedy he had penned with Harold Ramis. Reitman, feeling this fresh concept to be more attuned to his own sensibilities, eventually decided to leave the project to direct Ghostbusters, leaving any Hitchhiker's movie effectively, over the following decade, in development hell. A couple of abortive attempts to restart the project were made during this time, one to be produced by Mike Nesmith of the Monkees of all people, and one with Monty Python's Terry Jones at the helm. Of all the aborted movie versions, this is possibly the one that, as a fan, I'm most disheartened we didn't get to see, as it would have steered closest to the primary phase, though obviously it would have to have been a heavily truncated version in order to fit the 3 hours of material into a 100-minute runtime. It was to be made with British money and to have retained as many previous cast members as possible, Hitchhikers imbued with that Monty Python movie sensibility. In fact, had this version come to fruition, I suspect my only possible grievance with it would have been Terry Jones himself. Don't get me wrong, Jones as a director is a perfect fit for this material. However, my idealised Hitchhiker's movie would be essentially this take with one key difference: the replacement of one Python Terry with another. Seriously, why wasn't Gilliam's name ever attached to this project? The mind reels at the awesome levels of weirdness and out of left field thinking a collaboration between these two may have concocted together. In fact, in the movie we eventually did get, the treatment of the Vogons is so inspired by Gilliam's own Brazil, with both the production design and shooting style on the interior of the Vogon constructor fleet, and the lampooning of bureaucracy and red tape, with Arthur and Ford essentially being held captive and tied up with rubber bands, the mundane made epic. You can come away feeling Gilliam may as well have been there helming these shots on the day. While both these iterations were tantalising pitches, they would ultimately stall owing to the fact that the movie rights were still tied up with Reitman's production company, deeming the go-ahead on any possible movie version to be dead on arrival. However, in 1997, 2 important developments took place. First, Adams was able to purchase the movie rights back from Reitman, and second, this happened. A little Will Smith comedy called Men in Black became one of the biggest hits of the year, and all of a sudden, the potential for sci-fi comedy to do big business at the box office would, from here on in, inform a lot of Hollywood executives' decision making. And that's when the House of Mouse came calling. Disney, or more specifically Spyglass Entertainment, a subsidiary of Disney, bought up the movie rights, and development on the Hitchhiker's film was, all of a sudden, back on the table. Adams struck up a fruitful partnership with Jay Roach, himself hot off the success of 97's other sleeper hit comedy, Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery. Fresh drafts were penned by Adams, with a view for Roach to direct. However, owing to the lack of any green light from Disney, Roach eventually vacated the director's chair in favour of helming further installments of his own Austin Powers and Meet the Parents franchises, though he did opt to stay on in a producer capacity in order to guide the project creatively through the minefield of the Hollywood development process. However, the greatest blow to the Hitchhikers movie came on the 11th of May 2001 when Douglas Adams, tragically, succumbed to cardiac arrest mid-workout at a gym near his home in California, where he, his wife Jane and their daughter Polly had relocated, specifically to see the movie through production. He had just turned 49. Such a horrible event may have spelled the end for any other production. However, owing to a fan base, myself included, that felt as if they had been waiting, almost literally in my case, their whole lives for this damn movie to get made, and thanks to a renewed interest from Disney to give the green light to a science fiction comedy which was anywhere near fruition in the developmental stage, owing to the recent success of the modestly budgeted sleeper hit Galaxy Quest, Roach, in collaboration with Adams' estate and his former business partner Robbie Stamp, had one final stab at getting the project off the ground. They approached the music video director Spike Jonze, who was something of an industry darling at the time, having enjoyed great critical acclaim with his first two features, the Charlie Kaufman penned Being John Malkovich from 1999 and its follow-up 2002's adaptation. Sadly, Jonze turned the project down, citing the fact he was too busy. Busy with what is anyone's guess. The guy is notoriously picky and has only actually directed 4 films in the past 24 years. However, Jonze would turn out to be a key figure in finally getting the movie shoot off the ground. He recommended Hammer and Tongs, the director-producer partnership of Garth Jennings and Nick Goldsmith, to the producers as possible considerations. Hammer and Tongs had made a name for themselves in the UK music industry with their iconic videos for Supergrass's Pumping on Your Stereo and Blur's Coffee and TV. Hitchhikers fans from childhood, they were initially reluctant, believing the production would be some horrible, bastardized Hollywood version of the material, and keen to get their own debut feature, Son of Rambo, off the ground. Son of Rambo would eventually be made in 2007 as their follow-up to Hitchhikers. When Jennings finally read the script, now sporting posthumous revisions by Chicken Run scribe Cary Kirkpatrick, he was very taken with it, and, putting development of Son of Rambo on temporary hold, they opted to pursue Hitchhikers as their debut feature instead. This I kind of feel was, well, you can't really call it a mistake, more an unfortunate fault in timing. I would have just preferred it if there wasn't a first-time director at the helm here. The usual and far more successful sequence for an auteur director's career is to make the critically lauded low-budget feature before the mid-budget Hollywood movie. If the low-budget feature possesses enough flair and creativity, any flaws it may have, and there will be flaws, will be overlooked when making something tailored for a niche market. It's a mistake to make the Hollywood movie first, as Ricky Gervais discovered when he made his directorial debut with the deeply flawed The Invention of Lying, before returning to the UK to make the far more modestly budgeted and by turns successful Cemetery Junction. The Hitchhikers movie bears all the hallmarks of a debut feature. First-time directors are notoriously poor with actors. Often the stars of the film, Martin Freeman and Sam Rockwell, would have to insist on one more take, which were usually the ones that ended up on screen. Jennings was obviously not confident enough at this stage in his career to ask actors to play something multiple times, and this does lead to some sloppy moments, the way this brain removal device moves around on Freeman's head being a prime example. I'm not saying Jennings did a terrible job. Some of the things he included here, and even some of the things he chose to omit, like making Trillian half alien, a curious possible B-plot dropped from the final edit because it would have frankly added absolutely nothing to the story, shows the guy obviously has a flair for filmmaking. But even the finest in the business have to learn from their mistakes, and it's just a shame Jennings' mistakes were made on this larger canvas. Nevertheless, despite being wet behind the ears as a filmmaker, Disney obviously had enough faith to offer him the director's chair, and in 2004, after nearly a quarter of a century of false starts, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie was finally put into production. Jennings cast Martin Freeman as Arthur Dent, a very different type of performer to Simon Jones. I remember being slightly taken aback by his casting at first, assuming the role would go to an actor more of the well-spoken upper-middle-class variety established by Jones. Names associated with the role over the years have included the likes of the two Hughes, Grant and Laurie. When it was announced that the movie version of Hitchhikers was going into production, I was convinced that Jack Davenport was a shoo-in for the role. For Davenport, coming off the success in TV for his roles in This Life and Coupling, and just breaking into film in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, he seemed the ideal fit, as well as being at just the right point in his career for having a stab at Hollywood leading man status. However, Hammer and Tongs wanted to go in a different direction, believing the last human being alive should have more of an everyman quality to them, kind of in the vein of Jack Lemmon in The Apartment. They went with Freeman. Despite my initial misgivings, owing to the over-familiarity with the way Simon Jones played the part of Arthur Dent, I eventually had to concede that there may have been no one who would have played the role better than Freeman at the time. He is an actor with an adept ability to convey a snarky edge.
Anything else he's got two of?
And yet still come across as extremely likeable. No mean feat. Like Tim in The Office, Arthur acts as the eyes and ears of the audience, and Freeman is adept at playing the bewilderment of a character, frequently confounded by the insanity he sees around him in this brand new environment he has been unwillingly thrust into, a quality essential to the character of Arthur. He also possesses some quite superb comic timing.
I told you this would all end in tears.
I've often said casting against type can produce vibrant results on screen. An actor with something to prove is usually more compelling to watch than an actor going through the motions in their comfort zone. However, I will concede it can be a risk. If we are to take a look at the rest of the cast, I believe you see a greatly varying degree of success, from the perfectly fine, safe choices to the flat-out bizarre what were they thinking choices. Yasin Bey plays Ford Prefect, a US-born rapper turned actor who, at the time, went by his stage name Mos Def. Bey makes a perfectly fine Ford. I can't really fault the guy for the effort he put into the role. Initially unfamiliar with the source material, he would apparently devour the book on set, picking up on many an essential detail and incorporating it into his performance. The sheer number of things this guy finds to do with his towel almost makes the guide entry on towels seem less like a zany madcap parody of a safety tip essay on the perils of slumming it, and more like perfectly logical sound advice. His inclusion of the word Belgium at every conceivable opportunity shows signs of an actor that has done his homework, despite the word being firmly established in the novels as unutterable on most planets, apart from one where they don't know what it means. Bey would throw himself into the character with such gusto that he ended up getting accidentally drunk during the filming of the pub scene whilst in character, downing the real beer instead of the fake ones the props department had provided. He would immerse himself in British traditions and in the process would go so far as developing a penchant for that staple of the English tea break, the hobnob. And while the results are definitely there on screen, you still get the impression he was never entirely comfortable in the role. He isn't horrible by any means, but if I'm honest, unlike Freeman, there were probably a great many other actors out there who could have played Ford just as well or better. Actors like Sam Rockwell. I mention Rockwell, who, of course, plays Galaxy President Zaphod Beeblebrox, because Rockwell initially auditioned for the role of Ford, and man, I wish they would have cast him. A less jarring fit than the character he would eventually end up playing. In fact, I may go so far as to say these two actors probably should have switched roles, Rockwell having that grounding quality with just the right amount of off-kilter charm essential for Ford, whereas conversely, Bay's playing weirdness would have struck the right tone for the off-the-wall zaniness of Zaphod. Rockwell tries way too hard here.
They couldn't afford Jim Carrey, so they got me, you know what I mean?
Rockwell falls into that horrible trap of trying to do an actorly interpretation of Carrey's shtick.
You're too gorgeous, baby. Stop it. You drive me crazy.
I mean, he is a good actor, so he is able to play the shtick expertly. There is just one glaring problem, though. Carrey would probably have made this funny, something which Rockwell summarily fails to do. In fact, he can be quite irritating at times. Don't get me wrong, I've really liked Rockwell in a great many other things, and he's certainly not slumming it in the role. He cites Bill Clinton, George Bush, Elvis Presley, and even Zero Mostel as his primary influences. And I can't really fault this casting decision, as on paper it did kind of look perfect, more so than Freeman. However, Rockwell, I'm sad to say, is miscast here. My dream actor to play the role of Zaphod at the time? Bruce Campbell, who would have performed the role with just the right amount of lunk-headed confidence. Also, if you want the rubber-face antics of a Jim Carrey but on a budget, Campbell is your guy. Zooey Deschanel is very likeable as Trillian. By Adam's own admission, the role of Trillian is somewhat of a thankless one, there being not a lot there for any actress to get a hold of, which is why Deschanel, like Bay, falls into the category of fine, but there were probably a great many other performers out there at the time who would have played the role just as well, if not better. Maybe if sequels had been made, Deschanel would have come into her own more so, as she would have got the chance to play the elevated character of Trillian from novels 3 and 5. I guess we'll never know. She does have some great chemistry with the rest of the cast, especially Freeman, which would prove to be all important as the Arthur-Trillian relationship was elevated from the one that got away in the previous iterations to full-blown rom-com romance here. But more on that later. As for the supporting players, well, Stephen Fry as the guide is play-it-safe casting. I mean, he's perfect in the role, of course, if a little unremarkable.
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book. Perhaps the most remarkable, certainly the most successful book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor.
Several actors were considered for the role of the guide. However, Fry was, by all accounts, Adam's first choice for the role, and in the end it was conceded that there was no one else better suited. Fry is fine, but for me, he just isn't Peter Jones. Incidentally, the guide entry graphics were done by Shinola. I feel they are of note, as they have kind of the polar opposite effect to the approach Pierce Studios took with the TV series. Instead of a black background with an overabundance of text and jokes impossible to pick up on from a single viewing, here we get bright primary coloured backdrops and a sparse children's encyclopedia approach. This actually makes a lot more sense. The guide is, after all, supposed to be an information collective designed to be understood and referenced by entities from different worlds, cultures and backgrounds. So having this minimalist approach to the animation does lend it much more of a universal quality. Although I have to admit, I do prefer the TV sequences, if only for their retro look. Jennings and Goldsmith would apparently have to scour the animation on delivery, as Shinola were notorious for smuggling in their own overt humour into any project they were working on. The only one that slipped the net, to my knowledge, being this cow gag from the Babelfish sequence.
The practical upshot of which is that if you stick one in your ear, you instantly understand anything said to you in any language.
Not a terribly Adamsian joke, I'll grant you, but it's a funny one, so it gets the pass. Warwick Davis gives the physical performance of Marvin the paranoid android. Now, I am a Warwick Davis fan, and I don't believe the guy gets the plaudits he deserves for being the skilled performer he is. Just witness his mesmerising turn in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, if you don't believe me. Davis wears the prosthetic suit, which was reportedly 2/3 his own body weight. I've heard some criticise the suit, maybe because it deviates a little too much from the toy robot look of the TV series. Personally, I like this reimagining. The suit's ill-fitting sunken head only adds to the awkwardness of Marvin and imbues him with a kind of cartoon character with a complex persona. He plays the role with a world-weary quality that's never too overt. I feel Davis would ultimately become the most overlooked member of the cast, because whenever the movie iteration of Marvin is mentioned, all anyone ever talks about is how well cast Alan Rickman was as the voice.
Here I am, brain the size of a planet, and they ask me to take you up to the bridge. Call that job satisfaction, because I don't.
Rickman as Marvin is play it safe casting, and while he is perfectly fine in the role, he is kind of phoning it in. I mean, he may have literally phoned it in for all I know. I can only believe the casting of Rockwell and Rickman in this movie was as a direct result of them both starring in Galaxy Quest together 6 years earlier, making this a sci-fi comedy reunion for the two actors. Of sorts. But when it comes to voiceovers, there is one role which is woefully miscast. Helen Mirren as Deep Thought. In fact, the whole Deep Thought section is something of a stupefying misfire. Mirren's matter-of-fact approach to the material is so greatly at odds with the way Valentine Dial played the role that you are left scratching your head, wondering what it was the filmmakers were actually going for here. The key to why Deep Thought is such an amusing character is the fact that it is the most powerful computer in existence, and it knows it. Valentine Dial managed to instill a sense of pomposity and self-aggrandizement in his performance. To pull off this part, you really need to go for more of a Brian Blessed type. Mirren misses the mark here badly. The big comedic beats for these scenes are the facts that it will take 7.5 million years to run its program to find the ultimate answer.
But the program will take me a little while to run.
How long?
7.5
What, not till next week?
million years.
How long?
And the answer, of course, turning out 7.5 million years later to be 42.
The answer to the great question is
Yes.
42.
Here, these revelations are played so matter-of-factly, if factly is a word, you have to wonder whether the filmmakers even realised these were supposed to be jokes.
We'd really like an answer. Something simple.
I have to think about that. Return to this place in exactly 7.5 million years.
And once again, we are robbed of one of my favourite lines.
The answer to the ultimate question is 42.
We are going to get lynched, you know that?
John Malkovich plays Hummer Kavula, a character created specifically for the film, originally conceived by Adams as more of a Q from James Bond type, who would arm the heroes with the point-of-view gun instead of being the catalyst to go in search of it. He would later take up the position through Cary Kirkpatrick's script revisions as the film's central villain. Having Malkovich in such a role is very much play-it-safe casting, and he is, it has to be said, practically sleepwalking his way through the role. This is a fault of the writing just as much as the performance, as Hummer Kavula is set up as the big bad, but really doesn't end up doing that much to warrant this mantle. Well, if you don't count the decapitation scene, that is. I mean, why is Freeman so afraid of Malkovich in this shot exactly? What has he actually done to warrant such a reaction, other than having a slight menacing air about him? Like Deschanel, maybe Malkovich would have come into his own if sequels had been made. Or maybe Malkovich is just a little too low-key to really play comedy effectively. You kind of need more of a bombastic John Lithgow type in this role if you are to overcome the shortcomings a villainous character may have in your script. I've never been able to decide whether Bill Nighy as Slarty Bartfast is play it safe casting or not, as Nighy seems to be conjointly perfect for the role, despite not at all being anything like the way the character has been portrayed in the past. Apparently, Nighy turned up on set expecting to play old. When the filmmakers decided to portray Slarty Bartfast as corresponding more with Nighy's own age, it did rather detract from the original joke of having this little meek old man who has been lumbered with a very silly, slightly rude sounding name. But Nighy is still great here. Arguably, the best scenes of the movie are the ones between him and Freeman, where he manages to come across as both funny and whimsical in equal measures. And despite the deviation from the way the character was originally portrayed, it is still oddly perfect casting. And I can't talk about the cast without mentioning Simon Jones's brief cameo as the ancient warning from Magrathea, though why this is a standalone character and not a projection of Slarty Bartfast is anyone's guess. Jones has been a consistent champion of Hitchhikers since Adam's death. When he heard the movie was finally happening, he badgered Robbie Stamp to try and get him a walk-on role. His disembodied cameo apparently appears in 3D if you wear the glasses. I don't know if this actually works, I've never tried it. It's nice to see him in here. It's a shame the rest of the old cast couldn't have appeared sporadically also though. I always thought Jeffrey McGivern would be perfect as the barman, or Jones himself as a more officious prosser, if played in the same vein as the bureaucratic government type he portrayed in Terry Gilliam's Brazil. Watching the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie has always been a slightly odd experience for me. I've noticed over time that how taken with the film you are tends to be dependent entirely on how familiar you were with Hitchhikers in the first place. I'm not saying you need to be a fan to appreciate this film. I'm saying the exact opposite, in fact. Those unfamiliar with the previous iterations tend to be far more forgiving of its faults, as it does achieve its goal of moulding the material into a light, frothy, amusing Hollywood space adventure. It's only us hardcore fans who notice everything that's missing, even down to subtle line alterations.
On the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on.
On the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was the most intelligent species occupying the planet, instead of the third most intelligent.
Gone are the jokes about humans never inviting their ancestors around for dinner, or how the Vogon constructor fleet hung in the air exactly the same way that bricks don't. Gone is the guide entry revealing how the Babelfish is clinching proof of the non-existence of God, and there's no mention at all of the girl in the cafe in Rickmansworth who realises how the world can finally be a good and happy place mere moments before it is destroyed. Now I know styles in comedy change and change fast. The witticisms Adams wrote in the late 70s would have probably sounded archaic to a 2005 cinema-going audience fed on a diet of Mike Myers and Will Ferrell. It's almost a shame that this film came along when it did, as a lot of great Adams gags fall by the wayside. Originally, Ford persuades Mr. Prosser not to knock Arthur's house down by bamboozling him with a logical argument about how if Arthur is resigned to lying in the mud all morning, then the demolition team don't actually need him there all the time, and he can nip off to the pub for half an hour. This is replaced in the film with Ford merely handing out beers to the demolition team in an egregious bit of product placement for Cobra Lager and John Smith's Bitter. There is no mention of the Dentrassi caterers letting Ford and Arthur on board the constructor ship, which does beg the question, who does actually let Arthur and Ford on board? When Arthur inquires where he is, we get this little gag.
We're safe. Ah, good. We're in a cabin of one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet.
Ah, this is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I hadn't previously been aware of.
Which is replaced in the film by...
Oh, we're safe for now.
Good.
We're in the washroom on one of the ships of the Vogon constructor fleet.
Oh, get me home, Ford.
Arthur,
the great airlock joke.
You know, it's at times like this, when I'm stuck in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young.
Why? What did she tell you?
I don't know, I didn't listen.
Terrific.
It's replaced by...
Would you like a hug?
No.
Although I will admit, Jennings does something a lot funnier with the opening of the airlock in the film version. I realised that in 2005, subtle comic nuance was the order of the day, and clever one-liners were seen as old hat. But it's just a shame that these great jokes of Adams had to fall by the wayside. Funnily enough, I believe if a version of Hitchhikers were made today, a modern audience may be a lot more accepting of these jokes, if only for their old school charm. And I can't complain too much, because as a fan, we did get to see a lot of concepts only alluded to in the previous versions visualised for the first time, such as the beautiful results of Vogosphere's evolution, the jewelled scuttling crabs and the majestic wildebeests, which the Vogons enjoy smashing and sitting on to break their backs. We get to go to Viltvodel and meet the Jatravartids, creatures with 50 arms each who were the first race in history to invent the aerosol deodorant before the wheel. We get to see a religious ceremony performed at the church of the followers of the Great Green Arkelseizure, a being believed to have sneezed the universe into existence. We even get to visit Vogosphere and, sort of, encounter the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Tral. The film contains what would prove to be absolutely the final concepts Adams would concoct for Hitchhikers that we will ever get to see. The point of view gun, a device that, when aimed and fired at an opponent, will not kill them, but instead force the victims to consider and agree with the assailant's own point of view. This concept even gets the only original guide entry penned specifically for the film. As an idea, it's certainly a tantalising one, if a little underutilised. The idea of a bread knife which toasts the bread as you slice it is one of those lovely, slightly domesticated concepts that, if you didn't know any better, feels like it could have come straight from the radio series. That's if you overlook the slight flaw in its logic, that you would invariably end up with one side of cold, hard toast when you used it. Another original concept is the thinking cap powered by lemons, no doubt to sharpen up an inebriated brain. But for me, the most joyous of the original Adams concepts is also something of a first for Hitchhikers, a slapstick scene. I mean, that's actually what you get here, a sequence where the characters are repeatedly slapped by sticks. The scene takes place just after Arthur, Ford and Zaphod arrive on Vogosphere, only to discover the need to rid their minds of all original thoughts if they are to avoid, through a curious quirk in the planet's topography, a paddle to the face. What I love about this is you can practically hear Adams figuring it all out in his head, the great logical thinker he was. And laden with the task of providing a bit of levity for a cinema audience in search of mirth and merriment, he presents us here with his own unique take on slapstick, by, in his own academic way, dissecting the very elements that make up slapstick and breaking them down to their component parts, sticks that slap. The logic of actually evolving on a planet encumbered by such a quirk, clearly informing the character of the Vogons as, quote, bad-tempered, officious and bureaucratic, could possibly explain why their poetry is the third worst in existence, having been written under such conditions. It even informs the overall look of the Vogons, having developed these flat noses and battered-looking faces. This is such an inherently hitchhikery idea that for a while I was convinced it was cribbed from a guide entry in one of the novels. It was only on a recent reread that I discovered this wasn't the case, and the concept may have only struck me as familiar when I first watched the film, because I had read of it in an online review of one of Adams' early drafts, published prior to the movie's production. It's an engaging concept, though I can't help feeling there is some missing narration from Stephen Fry in this shot here to fully expound on the notion. Is it a perfect movie? Sadly not. Believe me, I'd die a happy man if it was. I've already mentioned one or two elements I have issues with, and I'm now going to list a few more. I don't like the way they did Zaphod's second head. The idea to place the second head in the neck and only having it appear sporadically was actually concocted by Adams and J. Roach as a budget-saving method, when it was deemed too expensive to have the second head residing on the left shoulder via CGI for the entirety of Zaphod's screen time. The two heads sitting side by side has that Python-esque zany quality to it as an idea, whereas placing the second head in the neck produces a result that has an unintentional air of body horror about it. If they had wanted to stick with the budget-saving head in the neck idea, why not a head that could periodically grow and retract at will? Had they gone full tilt with the body horror aspect, an idea such as this could have the potential to spill over into overt black comedy. As it stands, the handling of the second head doesn't really land as a joke the way it was originally intended, and if it is at all possible, it makes Rockwell come across as even more irritating in his brief moments as head number 2 than he was in the first place.
Oh no!
Ultimately, the decision to lose the head halfway through the film is a welcome one. However, the choice for Zaphod to be played as inebriated from here on in was a decision that doesn't really make a lot of sense, nor does it prevent Zaphod from coming across as any less annoying, sadly. The film definitely suffers from some pacing issues, particularly in the first act, when the 4 main protagonists are finally united on screen. Things really need to slow down, so the audience can be treated to some badly needed character development. Instead, we have yet more fleeing from the Vogons, and characters in peril, 50% of whom we barely know or care for yet. After they have made good their escape, we are given some okay character work. Freeman and Rockwell play off each other very well.
Sorry to hear about your planet. Nicole?
Earth.
With Freeman fully realising Arthur's increasing exacerbation at Zaphod's lunacy, which is so inherent to these characters' dynamic. But the scene which badly needs to be bumped up to earlier in the film is the knife toaster sequence, where Arthur, the eyes and ears of the audience, is treated to some welcome exposition from Trillian, as well as planting the seeds for what is to come later for this pair. How much the film would have benefited from swapping these two sequences around cannot be overstated. And while we're on the subject of Arthur and Trillian, let's address the elephant in the room. One of the most contentious fundamentals of this big screen adaptation is the Arthur-Trillian romance, absent from other iterations, save for a fleeting reference to Arthur thinking her beautiful and intelligent when he meets her at the party in Islington, prior to her being whisked away by Zaphod in the Heart of Gold. Now, do I mind the incorporation of a romance storyline in Hitchhikers? No, with a couple of caveats. The first being that said romance is just kind of badly handled. Well, in parts. The Adams-penned meet-cute stuff is nicely done, and it subtly builds up the relationship throughout the runtime. However, the film makes a fatal blunder right at the end, with this oh-so-awkwardly crowbarred-in monologue from Freeman, where he declares his unwavering love for an unconscious Trillian to, of all things, a couple of anthropomorphized mice. This speech is so clawingly awful and cliched that it practically sinks the entire romance B-plot, and any goodwill the movie may have garnered in the earlier scenes just gets flushed away in an instance.
And for 1 week, in my sad little blip of an existence, it made me happy.
Laboured, cynical, bad writing of the highest order, a jarring tonal shift of epic proportions. You can practically hear the moment Adam's keyboard ceases to clatter and Kerry Kirkpatrick's word processor keys take over.
Here's one. How many roads must the man walk down?
Hey, that's not bad.
Fine, take it. My head is filled with questions, and I can assure you no answer to any one of them has ever brought me one iota of happiness. Except for one. The one. The only question I've ever wanted an answer to. Is she the one? The answer bloody well isn't 42, it's yes.
What was it with anyone attempting to make the leap from British comedy television to the big screen in the 90s and early 2000s? Richard Curtis sure has a lot to answer for. Post Four Weddings and Notting Hill, the assumption seemed to be the only genre we were any good at in the UK was the rom-com. How this came to be is anyone's guess. The Brits are arguably the least romantic people on earth, and yet the assumption that we could produce convincing love stories on screen must rank as one of the weirdest periods the British film industry has ever known. So much so that when Curtis's own Blackadder co-scribe Ben Elton made his directorial debut, it was with a romantic comedy. When Ricky Gervais went to Hollywood, despite looking nothing like a romantic male lead, he made romantic comedies. And believe it or not, when Shaun of the Dead was released in 2004, it was actually marketed as a romantic comedy, with zombies. As if the zombies were just a minor detail in a film which was essentially the new Love Actually, and not simply a glowing love letter to the work of George A. Romero. Now I love Shaun of the Dead, but I'm sorry, even if you were to remove the zombies from that film entirely, what you would be left with would essentially be an acerbic story about the tail end of adolescence that periodically comments on the fraught nature of relationships for 20-somethings. A rom-com it is not. Nevertheless, the assumption that if you were from a British comedy television background wanting to make it in the movies, the only way you were allowed to do so was by making a wry, whimsical love story with a happy ending. This is why seemingly off-the-wall projects with a singular vision, like Shaun of the Dead and Hitchhikers, couldn't escape this pigeonholing in the 90s and early to mid-2000s, sadly. But I digress. I mentioned Kerry Kirkpatrick just before. The Louisiana-born screenwriter was brought in to hone the draft Adams was working on just before his demise, having, despite his North American origins, shown somewhat of a flair for inherently British material with his work on Urban Animation's Chicken Run and Disney's James and the Giant Peach, two films I genuinely like. Now, be under no misapprehension, Kirkpatrick holds a co-screenwriter credit here, and you aren't awarded such for a simple script editing job. Many of the film's scenes and concepts are either penned entirely by Kirkpatrick or, at the very least, involve him reworking ideas from Adams' original draft to a great extent. For the record, the major contributions he made to the screenplay was turning Hummer Kavula from a Q-type figure into the central villain, the order of the second coming of the Great Green Arkle seizure scenes, turning the character of Questula, as portrayed by Anna Chancellor, from the vice president into a Vogon cohort, and ultimately a potential love interest for Zaphod, thus eliminating any awkward love triangle element between him, Trillian and Arthur at the end of the picture, having Deep Thought create the POV gun, thus tying up the disparate dual quest for Zaphod searching for the gun in order to retrieve his second head, whilst contemporaneously being on the search for the ultimate question. That god-awful "Is she the one?" monologue from Freeman was entirely Kirkpatrick's doing also. In short, pretty much everything I don't like about the film. And believe me, this isn't some fanboy rant about how the work of my favourite author was butchered by a hack writer, not even possessing 1/10 the talent inherent in the voice of the author they were attempting to emulate. Well, okay, it is kind of that. However, if the research for this video has taught me anything, it's that when Adams died, he was 3/4 of the way through completing work on a cracking good screenplay, and unfortunately, the work done in the writing process post his death just did not come close to what was accomplished before. But believe it or not, I don't want you to think me too overly critical of this film. It's not a disaster or a travesty of the beloved source material. I'd say if I thought it was, believe me. There are moments in here that work as well as I could ever wish a Hitchhikers movie to work. What do I like about this film? Well, I like this shot of the guide in space, which appears immediately after the destruction of Earth, and acts as an entry point for the initial Shinola-designed guide entry. Despite taking place post the Dolphin musical opening credit sequence, having the title of the film appear once again, 10 minutes into the runtime, effectively makes everything in the lead-up to the destruction of Earth feel like a protracted pre-credit sequence, and frankly, in the Hitchhikers movie I saw in my head growing up, this is actually how I always saw the movie beginning anyway. Post the destruction of Earth is the perfect juncture to play in the Journey of the Sorcerer theme tune. Every frame of this little 60-second interlude is an exercise in cinematic perfection, if you ask me. I do remember feeling we may be on safe ground when I reached this point on my initial viewing in the cinema back in 2005. Of course, if the last 18 years has taught me anything, it's that fanboy pandering is not an adequate replacement for compelling storytelling and movie making. But as fanboy pandering goes, I still love this shot. Movie, consider me pandered to. I like the way the Vogons are depicted. As these creatures were always meant to be a sideswipe at British bureaucracy, it was the perfect decision to base their design on the work of the 18th century caricaturist James Gillray, an artist notorious for the way he would portray the establishment as grotesques, tailoring their costumes to invoke the look of various archetypes, like the High Court judge in the case of Gels, was an inspired choice. Another inspired choice was the casting of the League of Gentlemen to play additional voices for the Vogons. And for League fans like myself, there is great fun to be had trying to spot these little audio cameos scattered throughout. The creatures themselves were engineered and puppeteered by the Jim Henson Workshop, Jennings having worked with them previously on the video for Supergrass's Pumping on Your Stereo. And if ever there was a case to be made for practical effects over CGI, then it's right here. The articulation on the faces and body movement of these things really brings the Vogons to life and give them a lot of character. Having something real and tangible on set greatly enhances the performances of the actors. You only have to look at the CGI creature work Lucasfilm was doing at the time for the Star Wars prequels to see that while, yes, the same effect could be achieved with computers on a storytelling level, strictly on a visual level, practical puppetry is never going to have that slightly soulless quality even the best CGI creature work can't entirely eradicate. I also like the budget-saving quality of the project. Apparently, one of the things which garnered Hammer and Tongs the gig was the fact that they believed they could turn this in for half the price it was originally projected as. It was made for $50 million. I'd argue it looks like a $100 million movie. No big names were cast. There is an economical use of money shots, only being employed when they are truly needed for maximum impact. Tricks like having spaceship crashes take place off-screen and simply implied with sound effects actually help to heighten the comedy. There's an almost handmade quality to some of the production design, which is skillfully passed off as a stylistic choice. Miniatures were used. When Arthur and Ford are rescued by the Heart of Gold in the other iterations, there is a protracted scene of the characters believing they have woken up on the seafront at Southend, except the ocean is steady as a rock, but the buildings keep washing up and down. Shot on a Hollywood budget, this scene alone could have cost $10 million if everything in Adam's imagination, including a shot of an infinite number of monkeys working on the latest draft of Hamlet, was to be visualized. In the movie version, the whole Southend sequence is entirely removed and replaced with this one simple gag, courtesy of the Henson Workshop.
Ford?
Yes.
I think I'm a sofa.
I know how you feel.
Simple, economical, and, if I'm honest, a lot funnier than the original. In the scene where Arthur, Ford and Zaphod have to queue on Voguesphere, all the creatures waiting in line were realised by students from Wimbledon Art College. I mean, they do kind of have a slight air of a design your own monster Blue Peter competition about them. But again, This handmade quality can almost be passed off as a stylistic rather than budgetary choice. The keen-eyed viewer may spot a little cameo from a certain toy-like robot with a distinctly early 80s BBC look to him in there also. The production team even went as far as utilising that old staple from Doctor Who, the use of a Cornish quarry as a stand-in for an alien world. The climax of the film was originally meant to take place on Magrathea. The decision to relocate the action to Earth Mark II and have it all take place essentially in Arthur's back garden was an inspired one, grounding the proceedings and reminding the audience that despite being science fiction, the heart of Hitchhikers is directly inspired by the insanity which takes place here on Earth. I like all the allusions to British children's television from the 1970s, which is obviously a source of inspiration for Jennings. Name another Hollywood movie with such an overt reference to the clangers.
I think the Earthman's about to be sick.
Whoa, do it in the trash can, Ape Man. This ship's brand new.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, come on.
We have normality.
Did it work? Who was there?
Apparently, Jennings wanted the theme from Grange Hill to play over this guide entry. He even went as far as auditioning clangers and either the engine narrator Oliver Postgate for the role of the guide, Postgate's voice being synonymous with the type of warm, cosy narration Peter Jones delivered for the radio and TV series. I sincerely doubt Disney would have signed off on this bit of casting though, as they probably would have insisted on a bigger name. I like the third act from the arrival on Magrathea onwards. Well, I like most of the third act from the arrival on Magrathea onwards. One of the things I like about it is how closely it adheres to the novel. My favourite sections of the film are the ones which maintain the closest links to the novel. And this isn't just me holding up the source material as some form of hallowed text. The film genuinely elevates in the moments that cribs sections of the book, and I truly believe I would feel the same way about said sections, even if I was unfamiliar with the previous iterations. Adams stated that the problem with adapting the novel, itself an adaptation of episodes 1 to 4 of the primary phase, was that it didn't really adhere to the hero's quest narrative, essential for a Hollywood movie, that of protagonist wanting something in Act 1, in the movie's case the search for the ultimate question, the hero facing certain setbacks from said quest in Act 2, and finally achieving their goal in Act 3. In the novel, the heroes want to go to Magrathea, and they end up there pretty much straight away, the discovery of the ultimate answer being almost a byproduct of said journey. In order to make Hitchhikers fit a conventional Hollywood narrative, a lot of original material needed to be penned for the movie. So much so that despite the film getting the credit as an adaptation of the novel, it is really just the next in a long line of Hitchhiker's reinterpretations. The portions of the movie plot cribbed from the book include the destruction of Arthur's home and subsequently planet Earth, Arthur and Ford hitching a ride with the Vogons, being ejected from the airlock, rescue by Zaphod and Trillian, the journey to Magrathea, the Deep Thought flashback and the 42 revelation, meeting Slarty Bartfast, Arthur discovering the Magratheans are in the process of constructing Earth Mark II, and the meeting with the mice. The original material penned specifically for the film includes pretty much the entirety of the second act as a way of introducing some narrative peril to the hero's quest. The visit to Viltvodel, the Church of the Second Coming of the Great Green Arkle seizure, Hummerkavula, the removal of Zaphod's second head, the visit to Vogesphere, Trillian getting fed to the ravenous bug blatterbeast of Tral, the character of Questula, Ford, Arthur and Trillian actually meeting Deep Thought, and the POV gun. I like that they left in the bowl of petunias and the whale scene. One of the better decisions made by Jennings was to reinsert this passage, as it was absent from the final draft Adams wrote before his death. It would have been so easy to excise this stuff, coming at a point in the film where you just want the heroes to get to the end. The whale scene is so iconic, it would have been a travesty had it not made the final cut, and frankly, it's something of a small miracle that it did. The sequence has a beauty and poignancy to it, and ends with far more of a Wile E. Coyote-inspired punchline. Gone are the blackly comic gross-out sound effects of the radio and TV versions.
Ground! That's it! Ground! I wonder if it'll be friends with me.
Comedian Bill Bailey, in a piece of perfect, if play-it-safe casting, provides the voice of the whale. It's a shame Stephen Moore couldn't have done it though. I like this shot of Arthur jumping through the portal. I like every moment Martin Freeman and Bill Nighy have together. The planet-building factory floor sequence is so wonderful. I'd find it hard to imagine Spielberg at his most whimsical doing a better job. I really like Adams' cameos throughout the film. Thanks to a head scan he had done for his computer game Starship Titanic, they were able to incorporate his image throughout. The entrance to the Church of the Second Coming of the Great Green Arkelseizure was modelled on Adams' most distinctive feature, his nose. One of the planets under construction on the Magrathean factory floor features a reproduction of his face. It's virtually impossible to see, but his image is one of those adorning the tapestry decorating the exterior of the Heart of Gold. And when the ship makes its final improbability leap, the film can only end one way.
Not that anyone cares what I say, but the restaurant is at the other end of the universe.
Incidentally, just a small point, but why does Marvin say the restaurant is at the other end of the universe?
But the restaurant is at the other end of the universe.
Milliways is located at the end of time, not the edge of the universe, a fact which is made abundantly clear in the other iterations. Still, a nice tribute nonetheless. Even Adam's mother has a small cameo in the pre-destruction of Earth sequence. And finally, I quite like this version of the So Long and Thanks for All the Fish song, which plays over the closing credits. The Busby Berkeley-inspired opening dolphin musical sequence was okay as an idea, with lyrics by Jennings and set to music by the film's composer Jody Talbot. It's an amusing Python-esque way to open the film. However, it's the swing version of the song that plays over the closing credits, which I find the catchiest, and really encapsulates the joy this movie was at least attempting to exude. The movie version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a project that has left me consistently frustrated over the years. For every moment that is a perfect realisation of the beats from the source material, there's one that's ill-judged and falls flat. For every good performance, there's one that's off-key or just plain miscast. And for every unique Adams concept that hits the mark as Hitchhikers at its best, there's an annoying new addition that misses the mark entirely. I'm willing to concede that if I was unfamiliar with the previous iterations or not such a hardcore fan, I would probably be much more forgiving of its faults. It's not a bad film. There are moments where it achieves genuine greatness, but in a way, therein lies the frustration. The potential was there for a truly great movie. Unfortunately, every other decision made at the production stage was the wrong one. We ended up with a Hitchhikers movie, and as fans, that's still what we're most grateful for to this day. But alas, as fans, what we really wanted was a great Hitchhikers movie. And when the credits rolled in the cinema back in 2005, that's ultimately what we were left still wanting. So that's all I've got to say on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie. Let me reassure my regular viewers that is all I've got to say on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in general. I mean, that's probably a lie, but that's all I've got to say for the moment. If you're not a fan, thanks for bearing with me, as I indulge myself in one of my favourite pieces of media. And of course, if you are a fan, I hope you enjoyed the videos. And to you all, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I really hope you know where your towel is.